What is intellectual property? How often do you come across that phrase, intellectual property? On the face value, intellectual property is a compound word that is made up of two distinct words, intellectual and property. So if we were to put the words successively, coherently to make sense, we would say that intellectual property is a unique form of property that originates from someone's mind. Intellectual is a faculty in the human soul that is from the mind. Property is something that denotes that there are other forms of property. And so just on the face value of it, intellectual property is a unique form of property that originates from someone's mind. So then that means an individual should be aware of how their mind manifests. An individual should be aware of the actions of their mind. So not everything that comes from your mind qualifies to be property. Gossip is not property. Malice is not property. Ill intentions, not property. Ill motives, not property. Evil desires, not property. So what does it mean that there is a type of thoughts that actually qualify for property? Then it is important for us to ask ourselves, why did they attach, of all things they could attach, why did they attach property to intellectual? So in order for something to be called, or in order for something to qualify as property, that thing needs to meet this threshold. Property is anything that is tangible or intangible that has economic value and that an individual can own. So if something you wish to attach yourself to it, if something wishes to identify with you, the conversation, the requirement it must meet is there an economic value to it? So when we go back to our definition, the reason why we are referring to this type of property as property is because we appreciate that they have economic component. So that means in order for what you can create, what can originate from your mind to qualify as property, it is your duty as the thinker, it is your duty as the bearer to first of all appreciate that there are economic component that you need to arrive at yourself. It is something that you cannot relinquish. It is something that you cannot give over to someone else to figure out for you, could there be economic component in my academic project, for instance? So what are those things that can come from someone's mind? Melody comes from someone's mind. Lyrics come from someone's mind. A story come from someone's mind. A book, a portrait, a painting, lines of code, a sketch for a fabric. The possibilities are endless. The human mind has no limitation to what it can create. The only limitation to the human mind is the individual, their level of interest, and their level of awareness. So in order for something to qualify as intellectual property, it is your duty to first appreciate that that work must have economic component. Economic component. So your song only qualifies as intellectual property if you can derive economic value from that song, and if you can extract such economic values from that song, then your song qualifies as intellectual property, because there is another definition to intellectual property that I want us to attach. So intellectual property is anything that an individual can create from their mind, which that individual can actually commercialize. So then that means, my friend, in order for something to qualify as intellectual property, then it is incumbent upon you to exhibit or demonstrate that you are actually in the process of growing a market around it, or you have actually grown a market around it. So we cannot separate, we cannot divorce intellectual property from markets, intellectual property from products, intellectual property from goods and services, intellectual property from enterprise, commerce. So intellectual property is that unique form of creation, that unique form of work that originates from someone's mind that can be commercialized. So to this point, it is important that we bring in three often confused phrases and terminologies: intellectual property, intellectual property law, and intellectual property rights. Usually we think that when someone speaks of intellectual property, they are impliedly talking about intellectual property rights, because that is the common thought out there, that whenever someone starts off intellectual property, in my experience, in my professional experience, I encounter, particularly people in my space, people in the legal space, we often confuse these three phrases. Intellectual property is not intellectual property rights. One can have one without the other. Intellectual property is not intellectual property law. So what is the difference? Intellectual property, like I've labored to define, is that unique form of work that originates from someone's mind that individual can commercialize. So if a song has come from your mind, it is your duty to grow a market around your song. If a book has emerged from your mind, it is your duty to grow a market from a book. If a recipe, a menu has come from, or an ingredient of sort has come from your mind, it is your duty to grow a market around that recipe. If a sketch for a fabric has come from your mind, it is your duty to grow a market around that. Whatsoever has come from your mind, it is your duty to grow a market around it, because it is only the market that validates that work to be intellectual property. So that is intellectual property. Intellectual property law is an area of study, a discipline within the legal profession. Just like we have criminal law, we have law of contracts, we have constitutional law, we have family law, we have equity and trust, and so on and so forth. So intellectual property law is a body of law that people in the legal space study. So one can actually have intellectual property and you might not even have any clue about legal principles. So that is intellectual property law. Intellectual property rights, on the other hand, these are a specific set, a specific bundle of acknowledgement that a particular state or a particular government awards to an applicant. In every country, there are different processes that you need to meet in order for you to be awarded with certain privileges, with certain acknowledgements. So copyright is a privilege. It is an award that the state can actually award to someone who has met the requirement attached to getting a copyright certificate. So if you have done anything of physical attribute, if you have gone to work on something of a physical nature, the acknowledgement that you will get from the state 9 out of 10 times is a copyright acknowledgement. So we have trademarks, we have patents, we have industrial designs. All these are bundles of privileges that the state advances to an applicant. So it is an applicant who goes to the state that, you guys, I have created this thing and I wish for the state to acknowledge it. I wish for the state to advance me a privilege. Usually in intellectual property, the privileges that are awarded to an applicant are usually monopolistic in nature. So that privilege helps you to stop everyone else from taking advantage of what you have done. So that is intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights, whenever we are talking of intellectual property rights, we must restrict our conversation to copyright, trademark, patent, industrial designs, geographical indicators, circuit boards, and the rest. Whenever we are talking of intellectual property, then the conversation must be turned to, have you created a market, or are you in the process of creating a market? That is what we all of us need to understand. So in order for us to actually take meaningful use of this subject matter, it is important for us to distinguish this. Am I aware that my mind is constantly creating something? Am I aware of the functions of my mind at an individual level? Am I aware of the functions of the mind, the collective mind at an organizational level? Because it's important for us to appreciate whether the person is artificial, whether it's an organization, whether it's a church, whether it's a country, whether it's a company. It really doesn't matter. That artificial person has its own mind, and that mind might create through the instrumentation of the people, or that mind might create on the basis of the parent documents that caused that organization to be. So it is important at an individual level that you get to distinguish between intellectual property law, and intellectual property rights. That will help you to distinguish, what do I have? Every person, whether they are aware of it or not, has intellectual property. You don't need anyone's permission in order for you to have intellectual property. The only thing that limits us from accessing or from identifying the appearance of intellectual property is our level of awareness, our level of inquisitiveness, our level of asking ourselves questions. I want you to know from today, at any given moment, you have 3 layers of intellectual property. Whether you are an organization or you are an individual, at any given moment, you have 3 layers. At an individual level, you have intellectual property on your person. Just the way you look, you have intellectual property. If there is a striking feature about you, that is intellectual property. Your height, how you walk, how you talk, how you make people feel around you, that is intellectual property. Because intellectual property is, there is a lot of thought that goes into walking. There is a lot of thought that goes into communication. There is a lot of thought that goes into how I conduct myself. At an organizational level, there is intellectual property, on the face value of your organization. There is intellectual property in the name of your organization. There is intellectual property in your corporate color. There is intellectual property just on your logo. There is intellectual property on your website. There is intellectual property on your flyers. There is intellectual property in your products. There is intellectual property in your processes on the face value of your organization. The other layer of intellectual property, there is intellectual property in the things that you do and how you go about doing them. There is a reason why the Olympic, I think it's the Olympic gold record holder, Usain Bolt. There is a reason why after winning, Usain Bolt would do this. That is his intellectual property. There is a reason why Michael Buffer decided to create a company from his logo, his trademark. Are you ready to rumble? So whatsoever you do and how you go about doing them, that can give you an avenue that you can escalate it to intellectual property, and you can grow a market from that. In the business world, as an organization, there is intellectual property in your corporate processes. There is intellectual property in the knowledge of an organization. There is intellectual property in the culture of an organization. And the last layer of intellectual property, there is intellectual property all around you in your immediate environment. At an organizational level, there is intellectual property in the ecosystems that you've put in place merely by having your organizational, operational, and functional. So every one of us, we have intellectual property. The question has never been quite, Mr. Ogwang, do I have intellectual property? That is not the question. The question that every one of us should actually answer is one: are you aware of how intellectual property manifests itself on you? How intellectual property manifests itself on you, 9 out of 10 does not rely on a right, does not rely on copyright. You don't need anyone's permission in order for you to own intellectual property. The only person limiting you from accessing your intellectual property is your own self. You could be the person who is actually standing on the greatest discovery you can make at an individual level. How this thing up here expresses itself. How this thing up here creates. And are you aware when it is creating? If you can be aware, whether you are in direct employment, whether you're in entrepreneurship, whether you are in vocation, whether you're in freelancing, whether you're even jobless or you've been laid off, I want you to understand that as long as you are a decent person, as long as you are a person of sound mind, then your mind is constantly creating. Whether it's a song, whether it's a recipe for a book, whether it's an academic project, you can go out there and set up a company from your academic project. It is something that I really need to mention, that one of the most neglected form of intellectual property is knowledge, particularly in academia. We have never appreciated that knowledge is proprietary. What proprietary simply means is something that you can own. That is what proprietary means. So knowledge is proprietary. Talent is proprietary. A skill is proprietary. Everything about you is proprietary. From your voice, your name, and how you make people feel, all these are types of proprietary element that you as an individual should start owning from today. So let us go back. Intellectual property is a unique form of property that originates from someone's mind. That is what you need to understand. Beginning today, I want you to be aware of how your mind creates. And why do we call them property? Because they have forms of economic value. There is economic value in your talent. There is economic value in your skill. There is economic value in your knowledge. There is economic value in your idea. There is economic value all around you. That, my friend, is what all of us need to understand. Every one of us, particularly in the African marketplace, we have neglected, we have ignored our diverse forms of intellectual property. You cannot imagine the things you can begin to do from today just by acknowledging your intellectual property, just by beginning to audit at an individual level. What are my skill sets? At an individual level, what knowledge do I possess? And I can give you a hint. By the grace of God, if you have gone through the process of academia, the thing that you are advancing in your academic project, that is the beginning point of your intellectual property as far as knowledge is concerned. So, intellectual property is something that you have. You don't need anyone's permission in order for you to own intellectual property. Your intellectual property is waiting on you. My name is Ogwang Omuga, and I'm the principal at Franchise and Licensing Institute. We exist to help everyone we come into contact with identify their intellectual property and do incredibly amazing things at the marketplace, singularly relying on their intellectual property. You will not be the first one to put your intellectual property to work. You will not be the last person to put your intellectual property to work. Intellectual property is the greatest discovery you can make. If you found this video quite useful to you and informative and interesting, I would kindly ask you, consider subscribing and tap that bell button so that anytime we release videos like this on this channel, you can be rest assured we talk about one thing: intellectual property. Intellectual property has different outlets. Intellectual property has diverse inlets. And what we talk about here is intellectual property, and we will talk about intellectual property until the Lord Jesus Christ returns. Share, and I would like to interact with you on the comment section. What do you think about intellectual property? I will see you in the comment section. Until the next video, bye bye and God bless.